Welcome back to the Infinite Jungle. On today's episode, I'm going to be talking about the main takeaways of all core developers execution call number 205. And we are going to be talking about the early discussions for scoping out Ethereum's next upgrade after Pectra called Fusaka. Before we get started with the show, here is a show disclaimer. I need to remind you to please refer to the disclaimer linked in the podcast show notes and note that none of the information in this podcast constitutes investment advice, an offer, recommendation, or solicitation by Galaxy Digital or any of its affiliates to buy or sell any securities. Let's get started with an update on the Pectra timeline. Client teams gave an update on their status for the testnet software releases. They are on track and ready to share their most recent updated clients for upgrading the public Ethereum testnets Holesky and Sepolia. This is good news because this was the next immediate milestone that I had mentioned to our listeners on the previous Infinite Jungle episode. This milestone needed to be met. The client teams needed to release finalized software for these testnet upgrades by this week. We are recording this show on Friday, February 14th. Happy Valentine's Day, everyone, as a side note. Happy Valentine's Day. We're recording this show on February the 14th. And client teams, this was the deadline for client teams to publish their testnet client releases. They all shared on the recent ACDE call that they are up to date, that I think a couple of client teams have already published their testnet releases. Reth is one of those teams that I saw very recently put out their testnet releases. So this means, now that that milestone has been met, this means that the additional dates, the dates for when the testnet upgrades will happen, are more or less confirmed. Listeners can mark these dates down on your calendars. The testnet releases that client teams have put out all have configured in those releases a upgrade date for Holesky testnet on February the 24th and an upgrade date for the Sepolia testnet on March 5th. So these testnet software releases are all configured in such a way that node operators, if you're running a node on either of these testnets and you download this software, it'll have all of the Pectra code in it, and it'll also automatically upgrade your validator, upgrade your computer software to the appropriate new version on these specified dates on February 24th and on March 5th. So this is exciting. Developers have reached yet another milestone, and there's only a couple of milestones left, really. Once the Holesky testnet goes live with the Pectra upgrade on February 24th, developers will do some testing on it, and shortly thereafter, on March 5th, the Sepolia testnet will also upgrade. There will be learnings from both. As a note, the Pectra upgrade is the largest upgrade in Ethereum's history by number of EIPs. And that means that the surface area for attack, for finding bugs, is higher than previous upgrades. I would not be surprised if there was a bug discovered on either the Holesky or Sepolia testnets that makes developers re-release a new version of client software for Ethereum mainnet. This is why I would be cautious about thinking about the Ethereum mainnet date as set in stone already. Developers did say that at the earliest, they would leave 30 days between the public testnet upgrade of Sepolia, which happens on March 5th, at the minimum 30 days from March 5th before they upgrade Ethereum mainnet, which means that if both go well and no bugs are discovered, then you could see the Pectra upgrade go live as soon as around April 8th. However, again, developers will first wait and see how the public testnet upgrades go, and then set a date for Ethereum mainnet. I anticipate, again, because the surface area for testing and so many EIPs are going into this upgrade, there is a good chance that there will be a bug discovered that requires developers to create a new release, test that release. I think there's a possibility that the Ethereum mainnet for Pectra could actually happen sometime in mid-April rather than early April. However, again, as I've been kind of highlighting and suggesting on these shows, it's better to take Ethereum and follow Ethereum protocol development in a very stepwise fashion. Take things step by step. And the next immediate milestone on client team's agenda is really just getting through the first public testnet upgrade, which there is a date for. So the date of February 24th can be marked down in everyone's calendars. That is no longer a date that is subject to change with high certainty. Whereas the mainnet activation for Pectra, I would say, is still, give or take a couple weeks, still up in the air. To the 2 public testnet upgrades, I will add actually a 3rd Ethereum public testnet upgrade for testing Pectra that has already gone live by the time we're recording this show. The Ephemery testnet. This is an ephemeral Ethereum testnet that resets back to Genesis, I think, once a month. That testnet is already live with the Pectra upgrade, and any stakeholders that are Ethereum stakeholders that are listening to this episode and want to get a head start on testing out their validator setups or whatnot can do so on the public Ephemery testnet. That testnet already has Pectra live. So there you have it. That is the update on Pectra timeline. Let's talk a little bit about the Pectra retrospective. This is going to lead into the part of the show where I'm going to talk about early discussions on the scope of Fusaka, the next upgrade after Pectra. Because now that Pectra is close to being finalized and, there's no more discussion on what's going into Pectra or out of Pectra, really, most of Pectra is set in stone now. Developers are really just trying to make sure that it's fully battle tested. As battle-tested as it can possibly be. Now developers really are slowly starting to pivot to focusing on the next Ethereum upgrade, Fusaka. And one of the things that developers have been doing for the last couple weeks is having what they call a Pectra retrospective. Because Pectra ended up being such a large upgrade, and as Infinite Jungle listeners from Season 1 will know, the Pectra upgrade was split into 2 different upgrades. There was quite a bit of contention on what was going to go into the Pectra upgrade. It was a very drawn-out process. It took several months for developers to really get going with. It took time for developers to finalize the scope of Pectra, more specifically. And so they have started this public forum for gathering comments from client teams, but also the wider Ethereum ecosystem on what are some learnings from that process. What are some learnings from how Pectra was shipped that we can apply for improvement for shipping Fusaka. And I had a great episode with Nixo and Yorick last week where that was the majority of our discussion. We were sharing our takes on the Pectra retrospective on what could be done faster and whatnot. So listeners, if you're curious to know a little bit more about the context for the Pectra retrospective and what will hopefully come out of it, please do check out that episode. But it was brought up again in the latest call on ACDE number 205, and Tim, who chairs these calls, said the main takeaway from the Pectra retrospective is that developers want to upgrade Ethereum faster, that developers want to try and upgrade Ethereum as fast as 2 times a year as opposed to just once a year. And to do that, one of the suggestions more concretely to make Ethereum upgrades faster and to help Ethereum evolve in a faster way. One of those was to set higher testing requirements for EIPs. And one of the developers on the call, I believe his name is Mario. I believe he's part of the testing team on the Ethereum Foundation. The specifics of who it was that made this proposal are, as always, in the full call write-up linked in the show notes of today's episode. Mario, I believe it was, has created a detailed document, an official pull request on the GitHub of the Ethereum project on specific execution layer specification tests and implementations in Python for EIPs. These requirements he suggested should be made as a recommended for EIPs that are being considered for inclusion in a fork, and mandatory for all EIPs that developers do decide to include into a fork. And this was widely well received, I would say, by the developers on the call yesterday. However, there were some concerns shared about the bottlenecks that could be created, how higher testing requirements could make the EIP process a lot more burdensome for EIP authors. And so there were some suggestions on how to ensure that these kinds of suggestions don't make the testing team of Ethereum. I think the entirety of the testing team is really housed by the Ethereum Foundation. And they are apparently a resource-limited group, how to ensure that they don't become the bottlenecks in the EIP process, that the reviews that they have to do to ensure that EIPs are up to snuff and the testing requirements for EIPs are being met, to kind of avoid these slowdowns in the EIP process. There were discussions about, how to really ensure that higher testing requirements for EIPs don't put unnecessary burden on either the testing teams that exist for Ethereum or the broader EIP process, and doesn't discourage EIP authors from coming forward with really good ideas, really good potential code changes that could make Ethereum better. And so that's an ongoing discussion, and Mario is going to incorporate many of those suggestions that were shared on the recent call, and developers will hopefully try and finalize those kinds of new requirements for EIPs moving forward in the next couple weeks or so. As I've said on prior episodes of this show, the only thing that I think will make Ethereum upgrade faster is having smaller upgrades, having upgrades that that basically change less parts of Ethereum's code base. But that in and of itself also, I think, is very hard for Ethereum to do feasibly, for Ethereum developers to do feasibly, because of the fact that there's so much contention in what Ethereum should be and what Ethereum needs to prioritize. Every single client team, every single stakeholder in Ethereum has different views on what is the most important objective for Ethereum. And that is why I think these discussions for scoping out a fork become very drawn out and become very contentious, and basically lead to forks that are large. However, there is, of course, the possibility that you could end up with a fork that is very small, but it'll take a long time to really discuss that and to work that out, because you're working with a decentralized group of stakeholders. There is no CEO, there is no government that will just set the agenda. The process of decentralized governance is quite unique for the Ethereum ecosystem, because there is no blockchain project that is as active in governance as Ethereum and as decentralized in governance as Ethereum. So Ethereum has this very unique quality and characteristic that does result in the fact that Ethereum has these large upgrades, is slower moving, and the scoping discussions for Ethereum gets very contentious. So I'm gonna start talking about how the scoping discussions for Fusaka is going. I don't imagine that the Fusaka upgrade will be a small upgrade by any means, but I think there are, even I will say, learnings from Pectra that can help ensure that the decentralized governance making process for Ethereum is perhaps not faster, but simply more sustainable and can continue to operate in such a way that leads to healthy outcomes for the Ethereum ecosystem and community, that doesn't break break, I guess, the cohesiveness of stakeholder groups, and it continues to be a positive, welcoming, I guess, environment for developers to engage in healthy debates and still upgrade Ethereum and keep the decentralized governance process going. I say this as a little bit of a caveat because I'm going to talk now about the Fusaka scoping process. The scope of Fusaka was discussed on ACDE number 205. And the discussion got quite heated. It got quite contentious. There was lots of disagreement shared on the call. And for most of the call, developers were actually talking about the Pectra retrospective. Developers were talking about, just simply the process for planning Fusaka. However, the underlying disagreement about the Fusaka planning process came from understandings and opinions about what the scope of Fusaka should be. So while developers were talking about process and improvements to process, much of the disagreement shared on the call was actually stemming from differences in what developers wanted to see for the scope of Fusaka. So let me explain. And again, scoping out the fork, I will say, is the hardest part of an Ethereum upgrade. When you are implementing the specifications, there are issues in relation to how to make the design of this EIP better, how to make code more elegant. And there is definitely some discussion and some time that developers take, some arguments that are had on how to implement an EIP properly. But by and large, the most amount of time that is spent for an Ethereum upgrade, and probably the most contentious, is really just the first part of deciding what should get into an upgrade. And this kind of sentiment was also echoed on the latest developer call by Ethereum Foundation DevOps engineer Perry, who agreed that, scoping is really the part of the discussion that needs the most work. And to this, Tim shared kind of a goal that all developers, that all participants on the ACD call should try to strive for. And that is within the next 2 months, basically, ideally, a couple of weeks after the Pectra upgrade goes live on mainnet sometime in April, that developers really try to aim to finalize the scoping discussions for Fusaka by then. Whether this goal will be able to be reached is another question that I'm also going to share some thoughts on. But I just want to highlight that is the main underlying concern. Aside from these process talks and aside from the Pectra retrospective as a whole, what's really fueling this is these opinions and these concerns about what is the scope of Fusaka? What are Ethereum developers going to focus on next after Pectra? Now that Pectra is locked down and is close to being ready for Ethereum mainnet. So some thoughts on what Fusaka should look like and the scope of Fusaka that was shared very clearly on the latest developer call. Tim offered the suggestion, why not scope out Fusaka to just be PeerDAS and EOF? Developers have already pre-committed through the Pectra planning process that PeerDAS and EOF should be in the next upgrade. So rather than spend time, arguing about what else should be in the upgrade, just lock down Fusaka to those two and move on. And as developers are implementing those two upgrades, then in parallel, they can also start talking about some of the other overflow EIPs that didn't make it into Fusaka and plan that for the next upgrade thereafter, Glamsterdam. To this, Nethermind developer Ben Adams shared another addition. He agreed, the PeerDAS, EOF, he didn't have any kind of gripes about the inclusion of those two EIPs, but he suggested in addition to those two, developers should include two EIPs that would ensure that gas limit increases on Ethereum are are safe to do. Ben, he was sharing that these EIPs are not really feature adds to Ethereum, but are bug fixes that will ensure that the limitations set by the protocol itself are removed, and validators can actually safely increase the block gas limit from 36 million to, say, up to, or even beyond, perhaps 60 million. And there were some blog posts, I think, by Vitalik recently that was sharing that he would be very supportive of increases to the Ethereum block gas limit and whatnot. And there were other client teams, I think, that also shared their shared support for including these additional EIPs into Fusaka. Tim, Baiko's his last name, Tim shared some concerns, though, about opening the door to these two EIPs and that flinging wide open the door to several more EIPs. So Tim was more concerned about ensuring that developers keep the scope of Fusaka small and keeping the scoping discussions for Fusaka as short as possible so that developers can start working on it and then start planning the next upgrade after that, Glamsterdam. So that was another suggestion. Tim suggested PeerDAS and EOF. Ben shared that the two EIPs related to the block gas limit to help facilitate increases the block gas limit would be a great addition. And then representatives from the Geth team shared their thoughts on taking out EOF. And this isn't too new, like the sentiment from the Geth team to remove EOF. As some of my listeners may recall, including EOF into Pectra was very contentious, and there was fierce disagreement for that expressed by the Geth team then. I do think that overall the Fusaka scoping discussions are really only just getting started, but there is a clear goal, a clear date set by Tim, who's trying to encourage developers to shorten the scoping discussions as much as possible and to get to a place where developers can confidently start working on Fusaka with a collective sense of agreement and a collective sense of excitement for Fusaka. And his recommendation is that in the next 2 months, developers really try to figure this out. This does mean, of course, developers and some client teams more than others will be focused on preparing their final client releases for mainnet in lead up to Pectra, but hopefully all of that work is already done, especially because client teams have already put out their final client releases for the testnets, the public testnets, and ideally there's not too much change between the testnet releases and the mainnet releases. So to spend the next several weeks, the next 8 weeks, to figure out and to come to agreement about the scope of Fusaka. And I think that this is a great goal. I do think that if developers can reach this goal, it may not make, the cadence of Ethereum upgrades all that faster, but I think it would be a win for the sustainability of decentralized decision-making, of decentralized governance. Because if it takes, say, 6 months for developers to finalize the scope of Fusaka, then I think that just shows that, decentralized decision-making is truly not practical, and developers will need to figure out. It would spell, I guess, just very negative things about decentralized governance at work. But in order to do this, I will have to emphasize that making decentralized governance work means that individuals and specific client teams should not hold the decentralized governance process hostage. And yes, I'm going to call out the Geth team and individuals in the Geth team specifically about this. it was very much encouraged on the latest call that if the Geth team and individuals in the Geth team, if they don't think that EOF should be included in Fusaka, to make that case, ideally in writing, asynchronously from the call, ideally with insights and rationale that moves the discussion forward from their opposition to it since Pectra. Because back then, the Geth team and individuals from the Geth team did really make their case for why EOF shouldn't be included into Pectra. But there were lots of client teams that argued for its inclusion into Fusaka. And so the consensus there was that EOF should go into Fusaka. So if there's a reversal of that decision to make that case, and in the event that the majority, the rest of the developer community, the rest of the individuals on the call, the other client teams, if it is that it really is just an individual or just one client team that is opposed to this decision, then for that individual, for, say, the Geth developer or the Geth team, to not hold up the process, to not hold the process hostage by continuing to beat on the same drum and to prevent the rest of the EIPs that do have consensus from moving forward. Because at the end of the day, every single person in the Ethereum governance process has a different view on what the priority for Fusaka should be. However, there is, some collective cohesion. I think a lot of client teams are very supportive of the idea of making peer-to-ass ship as soon as possible. That is something that, collectively everyone can agree upon. However, there are other aspects of Fusaka and Fusaka scope that I think developers can all get on the same page about, except for, say, one client team or one individual. And in that case, for the individual or that single client team to not hold up the process, I think that would really be helpful. Because otherwise, decentralized governance it doesn't work. Otherwise, decentralized decision-making breaks down. And there was kind of a sentiment shared that developers should really focus on what the priorities for Ethereum should be rather than the cadence of Ethereum upgrades. There's Light Client, Geth developer by the name Light Client was saying that developers shouldn't be very hyper-focused on trying to upgrade Ethereum twice, but just be focused on what really shipping the upgrades that matter for Ethereum, which is totally valid and totally true. But I believe that that's what developers are doing. Developers are trying to ship code changes that matter as soon as possible. But to do that, there's going to be a variety of differences in opinion. Not everyone is going to agree with Light Client's view on what is the most important code changes to ship for Ethereum. And in this case, it's very important that disgruntlement about not having a particular code change that you view as super important, to make sure that disgruntlement doesn't hold up the process, doesn't hold up the ACDE process, and to allow code changes and upgrades to move forward. And in the meanwhile, still try and convince, other client teams in the call and other developers to gain support for your EIP or to gain support for what you think is better over time. But in doing so, to not let your individual voice hold up the entire collective. I think in this process, there's going to be quite a bit of contenders. There's the fossil code change. There's the SSC code changes that were left on the wayside from prior Pectra. There's EPBS. There's so many important code changes that the developers working on these code changes all believe are really important. But I think in order for the upgrade process and the decentralized decision-making process of Ethereum not to break down, I think it's really important to identify what is the collective opinion, what is the collective agreement, and even though that collective opinion and that collective agreement might not be uniform and might not be the same and shared by every single person in the governance process, if you are in the minority, if you as an individual or client team are the only voice that is opposed to a decision, then to not let the anger and kind of the disgruntlement of being the minority voice keep the rest of the collective back from moving forward with a decision and from finalizing, very specifically, finalizing the scope of Fusaka and start working on Fusaka. Because as that process moves forward, then that means that there are new forks, there are new opportunities where there's still time for a particular opinion or a particular EIP to get into an upgrade or to change Ethereum for the better. It just means that it might not happen on the exact timing that a particular individual or group wants. And yes, I think many of this I am saying directly to individuals on the Geth team, but it applies. It applies to all Ethereum client teams and for Ethereum stakeholders in the process. In the governance process, because it's, again, a very unique process that Ethereum has. Ethereum is the most active crypto project that has this many stakeholders engaging in governance. And if Ethereum can continue to make decentralized governance work at its scale, I think that is a huge win for decentralized systems in general. It illustrates how these decentralized systems can continue to be resilient, but also actively change, that there can be a governance process, there can be changes made to a decentralized system, even when the decentralized system has this many stakeholders. There you have it. I hope that you learned something new about Ethereum. I hope that there was learnings about decentralized governance. And I really do hope that Ethereum developers can reach their goal of being able to finalize the Fusaka scope sooner rather than later. But even if they don't, this show will still be around to talk about it all and to witness Ethereum protocol development happening in real time. Thank you, everyone, for joining me for another episode of The Infinite Jungle. I hope you will come back again next week. I am signing off from the concrete jungle that is New York City in your explorations of the infinite jungle that is Ethereum. Stay safe out there.